Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 9. Prince Piracetes had won for his empire a vast territory that bordered many peoples and contained many more, and had not suffered a single military setback upon the way. This cannot be said without crediting the Lithosis tribes, whose warriors were skilled and whose understanding of the world was stoic and completely natural. Bosporans of all kinds had come to know something of the origin of the world, which was translated and spread about the empire, then around other places as the tale began to intrigue travelling merchants. There was no use keeping the ambition of the Lithosis a secret, and plenty of powerful rulers were made sick from the stress of considering it. The easiest recourse for them was to dismiss the entire affair outright, and that is where most records leave the matter after first digestion. From the Bosporan records, though, we know that there was a great deal more to be said and a great deal more to learn, and I will now describe to you the military campaign that arose from this unquenched desire to win back pieces of our old history. When Coriscos had first declared its cityhood, there had been many rulers with an ear to the steppe who made a shockingly quick condemnation of the project. This description fits none better than the line of the Getae, who ruled cities and rivers in the lands between Olbia and Thracia proper, themselves being of mixed Thraci and Saka origin. But what does it mean to be Thraci or Saka? Both of these peoples are prime examples of half-men, whose cultures had not been especially changed by the effects of light or warmth after the Golden Age collapse was complete, such as the old Lithosis people who became the Greeks and Trojans, and brought civilization to the Inner Sea. And thus they remained as those peoples were in the times of darkness, creating a natural link between their origin and their disgust at the beacons of Coriscos becoming aflame once again. Their speed to recoil from this light was subtle indication of what their inner circle was privy to, and yes, it was true that Piracetes deduced this fact for himself, which we know because it occurred during open debate with a nobleman from the allied Carpiani tribe who visited Oyam. The Carpiani, new to civilization, were balanced on the border between the Olbians and the Getae, and as such had knowledge of the region like a fly sitting on the wall of a dining room, hungry but paid little mind on account of its stature. Once the prince heard the Getae had been hoarding resources and buying Greek slaves to work on grand projects, he knew his suspicions were correct, and that the Getae had been passed down a secret legacy they would now enact to protect secrets that empowered them. Bows were strung, lances were fastened to the shoulders of horses, and an army of riders was assembled from Lithosis, Roxolani, Scythians, and Greeks. There was no need to travel with a caravan now, for the force would head south through richer lands, where food was cultivated by insignificant tribes, and the people of these lands were well used to being tithed by whichever warlords wished to pass through. Therefore, in the spring of the cycle 183 years prior, Prince Piracetes set off for war, and the wisdom it might bring. Later, Diotrephes recalled the deployment thus: "I went with the prince to the edge of the camp, because he had asked me to help him with a small matter, and when we arrived to a place he deemed private, he said, 'I fear that we have come very far from home, and that I shall bid you only further. Since you are, I tell you, the senior prince of us two fallen acorns, I want to instruct you to do your will over mine. I am taken, I know, by these odd things we have found, and the world they hail from. Whether I will make good or evil of it all remains to be seen, and I rarely think I would care either way. That is the strangeness of it all. That is the excitement of it all. Of those I would compel to share with me this muddy and likely disastrous fate, I feel most guilty to be imposing upon you. So I shall release you to leave and take your place where you wish, unless, of course, our king has commanded you to stay.' After he said all this, I was lost for words in the face of the grinning monster, and eventually expressed optimism about the matter. We had been missing for too long, and ultimately returned to the camp with much unsaid. However, we both knew that our path stretched onwards to the same place, and furthermore, I think everyone in the camp wished the same for themselves." I chose this passage to share with you because it seems so unbelievable to we readers that our heroes were unsure of themselves, even after miracles and victories to rival the greatest leaders. This is how foreign and untrodden the path they were forging was, and forever they had to remember that the Lithosis were not people to be controlled by half-men, so the alliance was like a fire left burning unattended during the night. Yet it was a risk shared together, and they preferred that it be like this than to be safe apart. Those who have been on the sorts of adventures this campaign entails will likely know what I mean when I say this. This army travelled south towards the mighty Istros River, although the distance from Oyam to this frontier of civilization was twice that of Athens to the Istros, and there were many uncharted places to investigate on the route. Surprisingly, the army one day came into a wide vale that was covered in military encampments, and after forming up for battle urgently, they found it was an allied force of Olbian colonists and Carpiani nomads who were involved in a dispute with a Himanian settlement which had just been built in a place previously designated as neutral territory. The barbarian Himanians came from deeper in the European forests, and were not unlike the Helisi in their nature, being that the latter were influenced by Himanian conquests in the past. The main difference one finds is that they were more organized and dedicated to the practicing of warfare, and were completely at odds with many innovations of the South because they were too proud to have not invented them first, and therefore they remained in a self-imposed world of stagnation and war, like a finely sharpened sword made from soft bronze. There are too many tribes of this kind to count in the territories west of the First Lands, so where they are not noteworthy, I will group them by the name of Himanian for simplicity. Piracetes offered to mediate in the dispute, and was rejected outright by both the Carpiani and the Himanians, and so instead he agreed to capture the colony for use by the Olbian settlers, and renegotiate an agreement with the Carpiani. The Carpiani, whose wishes were ignored so thoroughly that we have no record of what they were, quit the scene and took their army to raid villages in the mountains that divide the steppe frontier from the better travelled world. This is something they did frequently, to the extent that the mountains are sometimes called the Carpiates, even though on most maps they are labelled as the Sarmatian Mountains. Since this settlement had no walls, Piracetes intended to take it by storm in a quick manoeuvre. He attacked from the south and west, and when the Himanians saw that the Lithosis were content to sit back and shoot arrows into the town, the former decided to come out and challenge for open battle. This suited the Lithosis well, but we shall focus on a less favourable element of the battle, which enchanted the prince with the notion of how easily life can be lost. He saw that some of the Himanians were fleeing the town on horseback, heading into a nearby wood. He took his Greek and Scythian companions to give chase, and found those horsemen resting their mounts among the trees, supposedly oblivious that they were being hunted. This was their ruse, and the prince was drawn in like a crab to a cage. As the Bosporans roared to announce their raid, the trees themselves seemed to come alive with deadly action. Men had been squatting beside roots, or roosting among the boughs, with a layer of brown dye covering their entire bodies, and that it was this extensive was certain, for they were naked, the only item they had to their person being an axe or long knife to sink into panicking men and horses. The prince's party was surrounded, and made to fight in close quarters. The horses could not be protected easily, and hence both Piracetes and Diotrephes were cast down to fight on foot, further set upon by the alluring riders who now came with spears, swords and shields. The pair united with the other companions behind the Thyrios shields, although Piracetes did not carry one due to his rank, and is usually reported to have taken to battle a hoplon and elongated coppice of the style used by junior cavalry officers in mainland Greece. Fighting to all sides, the companions pushed back towards the edge of the woods so that they could signal for aid. However, they were fortunate that some of the terrified horses had dashed from the wood in view of the rest of the army, revealing the danger. Thus, the Lithosis came into the woods with 100 more riders before the companions were able to signal their peril, and it was a joyous sight for those cowering against an onslaught of screaming axemen from all sides and above. The Lithosis made short work of the ambushes, and none of them attempted to escape. Once all were killed, it was found that half of the Bosporans were dead or mortally wounded, and Piracetes was distraught at the quick and apparently arbitrary turn in his fortunes. so Diotrephes, and notably no one else, claims. On the other hand, Diotrephes notes that the prince returned to his usual countenance after only 1 day, even though it would not be uncommon for an event like that to change one's character for the remainder of their life. This quick recovery goes to show how the prince was utterly committed to the future and contemptful of the past, choosing hope above regret, assuring all who followed him that these dangers and sacrifices were worthwhile without even saying a word on the matter. That is what I think, while others will write this part of the story as a parable of vainglorious, selfish or uncivilized behaviour. I beg you wait and see what else the prince did before you decide which you will agree with, for it is the whole tale that supports my position and only chosen incidents that support others. Many tutors told me things like this when I was young, so please understand that this way of reading things is the finest sooner than I did, for you will become all the wiser. The remainder of the Himanian force was either killed at a distance or surrendered, and it is evident that their best and fiercest warriors had all been committed to their plot in the woods. To give thanks that said plot did not succeed, the surviving Greeks made a sacrifice to Dioscuri, the twin deities thought to be behind the speed of the Lithosis rescue. This is not an unreasonable theory, for the Lithosis possessed a paragon deity of their own, named Dioscuri, a two-souled man who shared his second soul with Equus, the king of horses. Together they rescued those in need and taught common horses to be noble and civilized, which is why horses tend to be of a caring nature. There can be no doubt that this hero of old and the gods the Greeks praised were one and the same thing, seen in different lights, like how a tree is one thing in the day and another at night, despite not in itself changing at all. Once the townspeople had been pacified, a small number of Bosporans stayed behind to oversee the colonization of the area by the Olbians, who agreed that they would pay tribute and tax to Tanais in exchange for the aid. So whether the colony was truly Olbian as far as political power is concerned is doubtful. There was not so much difference between Olbians and Bosporans in this time, and I think that one day people will look on this time without enough care to make any distinction, as I happily do to the Himanic peoples. Furthermore, no two individual humans are like. That is the most granular thing you can say in these debates. However, there exist not the words to attend to this reality in history, so I take my weakness with my strengths and do my work all the same. After this incident, the prince and his army carried on south towards their goal for 2 months, without much incident, and with ample supplies brought from his Carpiani clients. There would be more action for this army by the coming of winter, but first I will tell you what happened to King Spartacus earlier in the year. Because the world is so balanced by the forces outside it that fortune and misfortune seek each other out, it came to pass that King Spartacus was in receipt of disheartening news that spring, which ruined what first seemed to be a step forward in his freedom. He had managed to repel a raid by the Alani on Sarai, who had returned in force to harass his project ever closer. In the victory, a great many enemies were slain and horses were acquired, and all celebrated the brief clash as if it had been a decisive moment in history. For Spartacus, the moment was still and empty, for a letter came with the night telling that a like raid had been carried out on Tanais with the aid of treacherous guardsmen, and a small party had burned and sacked the rich central villas. Whether these men were in league with the Alani, I am unable to say. Simply it is notable that these 2 battles took place on the day the Alani call the Feast of Api, which is the day when the steppe begins its cycle of rains in the autumn. Api, I should note, is what the Alani called Dagon, the Lithosis deity of the earth, and almost everything about these 2 cults were the same, apart from the name of the deity, a common occurrence among half-men who wished to distance themselves from their disappointed forebears. The critical blow they had struck was to raid the royal household itself and make away with 4 of Spartacus's 5 children, all of the same mother. They were Antigenes, Euthymius, Hephaestion, and a daughter, Dorothes, and Spartacus wrote these names on tablets that can still be found displayed in many places he went during his life. He did not lose his second son Dion, who was at sea with his steward on the day of the attack, and that was all the good of the day to be found. There was also hope at first that the children could be ransomed back alive. However, there was never any development along those lines, and investigations Spartacus commissioned concluded that the royal scions were murdered shortly after their capture, a fate shared by most of the bandits involved too. What can we make of this sign? It is, you are likely to realize, a grim and striking indication that the old ways of leadership were returning to the First Lands, and that Spartacus was due to lose the most, for loss is what a king must have to balance those many other things which they gain in their life. Spartacus did not maintain this attitude, and generally kept the philosophy of the Golden Age out of his court, or rather his courtiers did, so as to avoid displeasing him. And combined with the slow and uncertain journey his new city was on, it seemed that he had been forgotten by the gods, whom many accused were in turn being forgotten by the Bosporans. Despite such notions, the chance for the king and his enterprise to be destroyed soon arose, and the gods saw fit not to take it. I will explain what happened in detail. This affair began later in the year when the Alani came again to attack King Spartacus after having learned of a certain thing about his military style that constituted a weakness in rare cases, which I will soon explain. First, the Alani brought a large body of troops to resume their foraging in the rich lands close to Sarai, which prompted Spartacus to dispatch patrols around the area to intercept foraging parties. Whenever these parties were found, they would flee, and some of the patrols became encouraged to pursue them, remembering how a like action had brought about the stunning rout of the Alani main camp in the past. When Spartacus heard of this, he sent runners to recall his troops. However, this was not successful, and in giving reason for this, I must refer to an illustrative habit of the king's that reveals a crucial part of his character. He did not ride about on horseback, even when attending to business in the countryside, and would at most walk beside his horse as if it were lame. There are those who say he did this in order to demonstrate to his subjects that he was willing to live in the same simple fashion as they, and thus avoid a sense that he was of a different class to those who might be asked to die in his name. That is an optimistic view of the matter. The reality of it is present in many reports and rumours from those times, which state that Spartacus loved to approach his colonists and soldiers on foot in order to accost them about one thing or another, and that is why he did not like to be on horseback. There was supposedly not a single person in the world whom the king could not approach and immediately find something wanting, which he would point out quickly and harshly, bringing an implicit threat of military discipline even in cases where the law would not usually permit it. After the loss of his 4 children, the habit was likely strengthened, although since people were hesitant to write about these incidents, we cannot say for sure. This strict and direct method is, you might argue, the reason behind the high quality of his soldiers and the rapid arising of Sarai as a respectable colony. It is also the reason, I argue here, why many of his soldiers were eager to find someone else to be their superior, so that they could feel loved rather than guilty. That is why, when enthusiastic voices called for them to pursue the Alani that day, they agreed, and when the word of the king came, they could concoct a host of excuses to have not received the command. Thus the gods were given their chance at vengeance. Once it was known that a sizable body of the city's garrison was in grave danger of falling for the nomads' feints, Spartacus flew into a rage and went out in person to fall into the same danger himself, surely pleasing those who take the more favourable view of his mingling among his subjects. He rushed the remainder of his army out, and did not have any trouble finding where his patrols had gotten to, for they were perched on a hillside that ran down to the eastern plain, upon which the Alani's large camp was once again outlaid. Here they were being terrorized by the Alani riders further down the slope, whose arrows had corralled the Bosporans into a group that had to stand upon their own wounded. The reinforcements flattened the group into a coherent shield wall, and occupied a larger width of the hill. Still though, the Alani had riders enough to easily outflank them if they cared to advance. To discourage this, Spartacus sent the Cimmerians to shoot down the hill and drive the horsemen away. This was a bloody exchange, and after severe losses were suffered from the shooting, both sides backed away and regrouped. Spartacus looked down and saw how easy it would be for his enemy to be supplied from their main camp, whereas his position was too far from the city. there was no hope of retreat by ordinary means, for their routes were easy to cut off, and the enemy could follow and shoot at them the whole way. Therefore, Spartacus adopted an aggressive formation, moving his citizen soldiers partially down the hill, and lining them up as if he intended to charge. In response, the Alani opened up their ranks and saved their arrows, in anticipation of luring the infantry to be hunted on the plains like game. There was even a chance they would get their wish, for again there were those among the soldiery who wished to risk much to overcome the stifling judgment of the king. If they could achieve victory from this footing, they would be beyond criticism. It is fortunate that fear of death made an accord with reason to have them instead remain at the ready and then withdraw up the hill when Spartacus bade it. This withdrawal came in several stages, with such time between them that groups of the Alani returned to their camp to eat, and the leisurely pace of the day, while seemingly damning to the exposed Bosporans, was a key component of Spartacus's true scheme. His hilltop had upon it a sparse collection of trees, and the idea had been raised that some defences be crafted to protect the army or assault the enemy. After a brief assessment, Spartacus found that only a small number of the trees were positioned such that the enemy scouts around the hill would not notice them being cut down, too few to achieve anything substantial. Yet he ordered them cut down and fashioned into palisades and a rough gateway, as if he was establishing a secure camp. At the last of the day's light, he had those pieces moved into place at the crest of the hill, so that the enemy would see this camp springing up and conclude the Greeks were not going to attack or withdraw. Since this suited the Alani, they were able to leave the field in confidence and return with fresh supplies the next day to tighten the noose on their prey without much risk. Of course, the Bosporan wall was a facade, and once the troops withdrew through its gate, they were still utterly in the open. They did not even have tents due to the rushed deployment they had forced upon themselves. Spartacus gave some horses to trusted men and left them at this site to burn fires during the night and patrol the hillside, as if following the usual procedure for protecting an occupied camp. The rest of the force was made to grip the cloaks, weapons, and satchels of nearby men so that a few scouts could lead the army back to the city through the overcast night. In the morning, the troops still at the false camp scattered as soon as they saw riders coming towards them, and it was the case that by the time the Alani had digested the entire ruse, Spartacus was at the city, having rescued the majority of his soldiers and gained for himself a great reservoir of rebukes to use upon them. And no matter what is said of his usual nagging, here his scorn was righteous and in keeping with all the advice of the gods, and it was his own great deeds that denied the gods their chance to punish him for his supposed transgressions. Remember this before you say he was without fortune. But I will grant you critics that his many tribulations were often of his own making. It was what he would ultimately make of these that I wish to champion in his defense. Coming away from this precipice with his people barely intact, Spartacus was surprised to receive an embassy from the Alani camp the following day. They brought gold in quantities it was thought these nomads could not be capable of possessing, and they gave it over as supposed recompense for their use of the city's hinterlands. Then, quite cordially, they announced that they would consider the matter settled and carry on to their next campgrounds elsewhere in the steppe. The Greeks were shocked, yet could not find the guile to ploy against the circumstances, and therefore an arrangement was made, and the city was, you might say, saved from certain doom by the mercy of the Doombringers. Such is the mercy of the gods of old and new. After all that had occurred that year, the enterprise at Sarai reached a happy rest for the time being. Therefore, we shall next concern ourselves with the ferocious battles that awaited Prince Piracetes when he, still without his king's leave or foreknowledge, pushed through the Sarmatian mountains into the anxious battlefields of the wider world, with the winds of Dies and Dagon at his back.